Good morning, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. Hopefully the last week has been okay for you folks. I know it's been a little bit of a rough market, but I think like zooming out, we're still doing pretty good. So I guess in terms of my background, I by day, I'm an investor at Blockchain Capital. We're a multi-stage fund, been around for the last 9 years and focused exclusively on crypto, taking a very long-term approach. And there I focus on a lot of consumer-oriented projects. So pretty much everything in the DAO landscape, NFTs, kind of across the stack. And then by night, I'm also co-founder of Komorebi, which is an investment DAO, and we're focused on funding female and non-binary founders in crypto and experimenting a lot with what an investment DAO looks like and what that model might evolve into and what some of the pros and cons are. So today, I really just wanted to talk a little bit about DAOs at a high level and just thinking through what the future of the space could look like. It feels like a lot of the conversation around DAOs has been, boiled down, I think, into like a few short sound bites, but really there's a lot to kind of unpack. And so hoping to sort of cover the state of DAOs today, and then also just think through some interesting ideas and questions around what they might look like and where they might be used in the future. And then, I would love this to be conversational. So if you guys have questions, like feel free to post them in the chat or just like, interrupt me and ask questions. Doesn't have to be sort of like lecture format, whatever works for the group. So I guess just to get started, just to sort of level set, I know folks on the call have different maybe levels of, I guess, understanding or just being in tune with DAOs. What is a DAO and what exactly does this even mean? It stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. That's kind of what the acronym stands for. But really to sort of break that down, I like this definition that was, I think Peter, who's an investor at 1KX, is kind of wrote this definition, but he says that DAOs are really internet native organizations. So focus on just the internet native piece for a second. Really what he's talking about is that, up until now, a lot of organizations start with the physical and real life. And this is sort of the next chapter of what being an internet born organization might look like. And then he goes to say that they're run and managed by communities through transparent decision-making processes. So these are sort of digital focused communities that are run and managed from the ground up is really what he's talking about. And they have this transparent decision-making process. And I think when you break that down, there's a couple of sort of principles that stand out. First is that they're, again, digital focused. 2, that they're bottoms up. And then 3, that the transparency makes itself so anybody should be able to sort of join or iterate on processes, and it's very much sort of open source, not in the sense of open source, code, but open source in the sense that everybody can kind of come together and figure out what this community looks like. I think important to notice, he doesn't mention anything about the product. He doesn't mention anything about treasuries or tokens or token economics. I think these are all sort of additions that the community has made over the past few years to really start to add structure to this idea of a DAO. But I think at the end of the day, it's really thinking about coordination and what that coordination looks like online versus what we've traditionally done with organizations. And so today, I think if you were to look at some of the categories of DAOs, we've got, protocol DAOs. This is really where a lot of the technical products come into play. So we're talking about, in DeFi, Uniswap or, Aave or Yearn or Sushi, any of these projects that have really operated in a DAO format. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we have, service DAOs, investment DAOs like Komorebi, social DAOs, tons of other sort of categories popping up. And really at the end of the day, there's, I think, a lot of just experimentation of, what can you organize online and sort of build with a community and what does, what makes sense for communities to build versus not. and in particular, how can we leverage the protocol piece or the software piece to help with that coordination, whether it's with the treasury or just via voting and governance and some of these principles that we talk about a lot. I think at the end of the day, though, what we're starting to see is that today DAOs are not decentralized or autonomous, which is really challenging because we've put this, like, call it a North Star, and said, hey, we're going to create these super distributed, decentralized groups that have this ability to sort of execute in an autonomous fashion. And then the reality is a lot of DAOs are talking a lot in Discord, talking a lot in Telegram, hounding people to get them to vote. At the end of the day, a lot of times, like, decision making is really driven by a small group of people. So unfortunately, the reality looks very different than what we think this could look like in the future. And that's really why I think this is a multi-decade phenomenon. I don't think this is something that we're going to solve in the next 2 years or 5 years. But I think from a product perspective, this is more of or maybe not even product, but like from a tool perspective, this is more of a multi-decade phenomenon where we start to see sort of iterations of the decentralized and autonomous emerge. So that's kind of, I think, what the present landscape looks like. And then I think I just want to touch on really quickly what some of the properties are for DAOs and sort of what we can do to maybe get there, or how people are starting to think about like what these definitions mean. So in my mind, there's, five, I guess you can call it 5 properties of DAOs. And I'm just going to kind of list these 5 out, but then would love to talk through each one and sort of what they mean and the promise of them. So the first is that they're co-owned. The second is that they're permissionless. Third is transparent. Fourth is self-preserving, and fifth is scalable. And I think can be sort of these properties can probably be flexible and iterate depending on who you're talking to. But this is really what I've sort of gathered through a lot of conversations, that DAOs are striving to be these 5 things. And so I think the top most principle that's important is this idea of co-ownership. And specifically this idea that, today we have all these organizations, whether it's social media or other platforms on the internet, where the primary recipient of the value has been the shareholders and the early team or the founder, and the users of the platforms that really make the platform what it is today don't really benefit. At the end of the day, yes, we're able to be on Twitter for free or Facebook for free, but it's at the cost of, data and our attention. And so is there a better model out there where users of social platforms can be a part owner from day one and receive some sort of value back for being part of that process? And I think that co-ownership is really the core sort of tenet of DAOs, where you put in work and then you receive value back, and you are then able to sort of have skin in the game from day one. And I think this has a lot of just power when it comes to motivation and incentivizing a group of people to help build something. So that's number one. Number two is this concept of being permissionless. And I think you'll hear this word being thrown around in crypto quite a bit. I think being permissionless is a goal of protocols. It's a goal of communities. It's, there's a lot of different definitions. But I think what this really is referring to is the fact that anyone can participate, or people have the ability to at least get access. So it's not to say that you are 100% can join and that anybody can do whatever they want to do, but that, the pathways to participating or onboarding are made, readily available, or at least that's the way that I've been sort of thinking about this in terms of DAOs. And again, this comes back to the concept that in order for internet organizations to truly scale, they have to be or not, they don't have to, but they're better positioned when they're more open. The third piece is this idea of transparency. And I think what folks really think about with transparency is, oh, you can go on to, Etherscan or wherever, and you can sort of see what the transactions are happening and sort of trace money back to where it comes from. I think that's, one form of transparency, but I think in reality, the other form of transparency that's probably the more, I think, more relevant to DAOs is about information and making sure that like processes and information is readily available for anyone to come and sort of audit and do their own sort of self audit. And so I think in the DAO space today, some of the biggest examples of where transparency can really be important is when you're thinking through what does a treasury look like, or what do proposals look like for particular functions within a DAO. And as you get deeper into the DAO space, you'll start to realize that governance is one of those things people discuss a lot, and the questions around who's proposing what and who has the authority to do what becomes a very sort of political conversation. And so I think transparency kind of comes in. So I see there's a question here. Why do you think DAOs aren't fully decentralized or autonomous yet? What will it take to get there? I think there's a few things that haven't really been solved for. So the first is that we don't necessarily know what autonomous or decentralization looks like in its like final form. I think there's still a lot of like conversations today around, is Ethereum decentralized enough? And then like, what are some of the metrics or measures of how you can see what that looks like? Or are other blockchains decentralized enough? So I think that's one thing, is we're not exactly sure what that final form looks like. And then I think on the autonomous piece, when I think of autonomous, I really think of being able to have sort of some level of like self-execution or automatic execution, whether it's as it relates to like the contracts that govern a DAO or decision-making processes. And I think we're just really early in what these organizations look like. And so having things be fully autonomous, I'm not sure it even really makes sense right now. I think in order for us to get there, some of these properties, so being co-owned and having transparency and being sort of like self-preserving and scalable, I think some of those need to be realized fully. And we really need to focus on not just our DAOs a way of coordinating capital, but we're coordinating labor. So what does it mean to coordinate labor? How do you bring on contributors or allow contributors to exit, or what we call, rage quit, in a manner that doesn't disrupt the function of a DAO? All these questions I think still need to be answered. And I think at the core of it all, we also just need to think through DAOs themselves as not being the product or not sort of the end, but a means to an end, right? So what is the end that we're hoping to achieve, whether it's a community to fund public goods, or it's a protocol that launches financial products, or whatever it may be. Like, we need to think through what is that product first before we, I think, really can use DAOs as like a successful way to get there. Seeing another question, role model DAOs. Yeah, they're doing a great job while delivering value. That's a great question. I think for me, at least, some of the best use cases for DAOs have really emerged in the protocol space and are likely, I think, further ahead, just given where the market has been, in the sense that they've been able to sort of be building for the past few years. So folks like Compound or Uniswap or Aave, I think, have done a really great job at transitioning into what a DAO looks like. Maybe Uniswap has struggled a little bit, but I think Compound and Aave in particular have done a great job. Where, like the token, I think, was launched post having a product in the market. So the value that they were providing to the market through the form of lending was very clear. This is a product that you can use to do lending in crypto, in DeFi. And then they launched a token, and that token was really rewarding people that used the protocol. And then even moving forward, the token is now used as a way to sort of incentivize the governance of that protocol and really make it so that folks can sort of participate in this community. So I think a lot of these protocol DAOs have just done a great job of like building something that's needed in the market, and then once they've productized it, becoming a DAO sort of over time, and then leveraging their community. I think if we think about like some of the other categories, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in like the funding, ecosystem. So like Moloch DAO or Meta Cartel Ventures are some really great examples of DAOs that are focused on investing or grants. And they're basically using this idea of having like a shared treasury to be able to fund projects and then deliver that value back to whoever it is that they're funding. But they've really started to like productize what it means to vote on investments or vote on grants, and to have all of these contracts live on chain and be able to audit their treasury and be able to sort of see where they're investing and who's investing in what. So I think those are some of the categories I think that might have been a little bit more successful. So non-DeFi or non-investment. So I think, at the height of the bull market last year, there was a lot of excitement around models like friends with benefits. And I'm still I'm very much a supporter of friends with benefits. And for those of you that might not know, friends with benefits is kind of this idea of having like a digital, or like an internet native social club, or, maybe even I can go far as calling it just like a country club online or something like that. And it was this concept that this community could provide value back to its users through events, through education, through content and social coordination, all of that. But it's not. Yep, it is the opposite of permissionless. Exactly. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think Friends with Benefits was this experiment of like, okay, what would a social DAO actually look like, where at the end of the day, the community is the product. And I think what they quickly realized is that in order for them to be successful, they have to, always onboard new users. And given that the token is inherently linked to onboarding of new users, as the price of their token went up, it became increasingly not scalable, because people couldn't necessarily afford to join, and it was very much permissioned by this idea of holding the token. So I think social DAOs is an area that I continue to be really excited about, but unfortunately, I think there's still a lot of challenges to be solved for, especially when it comes to how do you onboard new users? How does it remain permissionless and transparent, or even be like that to begin with? So I think that's a category that still needs some work, but there's some other interesting examples there too. And then the other category that I'm really excited about is service DAOs. And so service DAOs are really DAOs that are focused on providing one horizontal service, and then kind of leverage that service that they offer, and they're able to kind of go and provide it to a number of organizations. So there's a few examples, like Vector DAO does design, and Llama does treasury management, and you can kind of keep going. Again, though, I think the challenge here is that I'm not sure how permissionless this is today. At the end of the day, there's still a manual process in terms of people joining the community or leaving the community. It's not quite as again, like autonomous or decentralized as we might hope it would be in the future. And so at the end of the day, I think a lot of the DAOs in practice are trying to figure out how to get there, but the work that they put in on a day-to-day basis, kind of is still more centralized and more permissioned than one would hope.
I guess on the permissionless piece, like, do DAOs, is it bad to be permissioned? Like, isn't that a choice that organization is making?
Yeah, I guess it's a good point. I guess I think it kind of comes down to the question of like, if you want to be permissioned, you don't necessarily want to be particularly transparent. Scalability is a challenge, or scalability, like by definition of how blockchains define it, is not necessarily a goal. Like the question does come down, like, should this be a company, right? Yeah. Should this just be like a corporation? And so I think it's unfortunate, but like that's sort of the hard question that a lot of these communities face is like, would this just be a lot more effective if you just incorporated as a company, and like built a team and kind of like went after this and didn't have to ask permission every time you wanted to do something from the community, right? Like a lot of these experiments, unfortunately, I think are just better as companies, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's why I think this question comes down to like, what should a DAO be, or like what types of organizations are better suited to become a DAO versus not. And I think that's also why there's this very active sort of, I don't know if you want to call it a meme, but like it's kind of become this meme of like progressive decentralization of we're going to start as a company and then over time we'll decentralize and exit to community. But oftentimes it's like, in order to sort of build the thing, you start out as a company. And so again, the question becomes like, when does it make sense to decentralize versus just to continue to run and operate this as a for-profit community or company?
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Yeah, go ahead. Continue. You can go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess like the other two areas that I think are really interesting to think through is like, how can they be self-preserving? So what I mean by that is like, one thing that I think about a lot with DAOs is like, what's the time horizon? So when I think about a DAO like, Ethereum, which I consider Ethereum to be a DAO. Some people don't, but I think Ethereum's a DAO. Like to me, that time horizon is, for all intents and purposes, like infinity. I'm really thinking about this as being a self-preserving community where everybody who sort of joins the Ethereum community in one way, shape, or form is working to preserve that. And there isn't sort of the central point of failure, and there isn't this notion that like if XYZ were particular member were to leave, then you wouldn't be able to preserve what you have. I mean, obviously there's some like maybe the asterisk there is around Vitalik, but in general, I would think of that as a self-preserving organization. And I think that's really something that the communities that I'm talking to and hearing are having a difficulty scaling, is like, how do you scale like values and mission, and that like feeling that people will pick up work and pick up ideas and run with them, and they're sort of true to that DAO without needing somebody to sort of be like the leader. So I think that idea of like self-preserving is something that a lot of DAOs I think are struggling with, but I think will be really interesting to see what that ends up looking like. And then last question, or last property, is scalability. And again, like this notion of, do DAOs need to scale? And if they do need to scale, in what way? Like, should there be hundreds or thousands of DAOs? Should there be thousands of contributors? Is a DAO that has 20 people that are working on something enough? And then like, does this scale in terms of treasury, or in terms of like some sort of metric that's similar to a product? Maybe not. So I think just like a lot of questions around scalability and what this might look like in the future is also a property to think through. And I personally think that DAOs should scale in terms of their impact, but not necessarily in terms of any particular like one metric, more just like, can these things exist in perpetuity, and can the ideas sort of scale in time? Yeah, I mean, I guess I have a few other things, but I know there's conversation happening in the chat. So I think I'd rather maybe just jump over to the chat, and would love to open it up to like any discussion points or any questions that folks have. Yeah, all of the above.
Yeah, and just on your point on the protocol, you mentioned protocols DAOs being the most successful, I guess, so far, or exemplar DAOs. That leads me to question, like, I guess, does having a product or a protocol, whatever, make a huge difference in making the DAO successful, because people can coalesce around the product and the mission is basically the product or the protocol, versus a purely community or social DAO where there's really no product to rally around. So it's just, you're kind of rallying around yourselves. And I wonder how sustainable that is. Like, for example, an example that comes to mind is like developer DAO. It's very high. It's really cool. There's like a ton of really smart developers in it, but I think at some point they're going to run into the wall where they're struggling to understand like what they exist for. Is it just a bunch of developers that are hanging out, or like what's their purpose? Because they don't have a product. Curious to hear if like you think about it that way or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, I do. So the reason I think like the product versus, you know, the community is the product phenomenon or like question keeps coming up is because most DAOs are trying to represent value via a token, right? And it's very difficult to then say like, well, this token ties back to effectively just being a way to like gate permission into a community. If you hold the token, then you get access to this community, and if you don't hold the token, then it's difficult to get access to this community. So I think they're kind of at odds with one another, and that's part of what I struggle with. Like, on one hand, ideologically, I know that communities have value, and I know that being in a particular group of people online can have like a function in and of itself. But oftentimes I do think like a product is better for tying folks to some sort of mission or towards some sort of goal. So I don't necessarily have an answer, but I think right now the product focused DAOs are slightly more oriented towards like tying value to their token, which I think is just important for like long-term, long-term how I think about DAOs evolving.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. John, do you want to go?
Oh, I think you're muted, John.
There we go. That would help. So last night there was, you could call it an exploit, I guess, but talking to you today, it really made me think. So long story short, through a DAO vote, a guy was able to enable lending of a well-known and long-time unpegged stablecoin. But this lending protocol had it hard pegged to $1, but it was deactivated, so like nobody cared. Well, this guy acquired enough tokens to vote and re-enabled lending for that stable coin, and then went out and minted a bunch of it and lent it to the protocol. It was worth like 60 cents on the dollar, but this protocol had it hard coded at $1. So then he was able to borrow a lot more than he supplied, which, as we know, is going to create insolvency, basically drained all the other stable vaults or pools or whatever on this lending protocol, and he's never going to pay it back. Why would he? He just, gave you 60 cents and took $1. So according to the bylaws, if you will, or whatever, the guidelines of this DAO, like literally nothing wrong happened. It was perfectly planned the way this DAO was supposed to work. So I was curious, in your mind, is there some difference between like a lazy DAO, somebody who didn't see this coming? Because like anybody could have seen this coming. And I guess on the other end of that question is seeing what Optimism's doing, where they're splitting up the governance, if you will, between like the token house and the people house. And even in the token house, there's this quantitative like easing thing where kind of like Gitcoin, where it at some point on the curve kind of mutes the power of whales. So you could have a ton of Optimism tokens, but at some point you're getting a diminishing return in voting power, which should protect manipulation like this, maybe from happening in the future. So do you see that as the evolution, I guess is what I'm going, or the next step in protocol governance?
Yeah, I'll have to look into that. I didn't realize that happened yesterday, but I do think like some of the experimentation around governance that Optimism is going to be really like important and interesting to sort of pay attention to, because that has been like a really big conversation, is like, how do you think about almost segmenting your user population and your voter population? And then based on their perspective, or based on like where they're playing from, they're going to have a different role in governance, right? So like investors are going to have a different role, market makers might have a different role, whales might have a different role versus like a retail user. And I think they need to be weighted accordingly. And also this just like delegation is going to play a bigger role. I mean, at the end of the day, it sometimes feels like we're really just headed towards like experimenting with, you know, the hundreds of years of government that we've already experimented with, and just doing this on chain.
Yeah.
And so I definitely think that that's going to be important to pay attention to see if this two token, you know, the governance one versus the people one, if this model really works out. But it's going to take some time to figure out if it does.
Great. Thank you.
Thomas, do you want to go for it?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, why do you think that, since I think like the terms DAOs and DAC were both like coined, I don't remember if it was Vitalik or Daniel Larimer, the guy who created EOS back in 2013. Like, why has the zeitgeist shifted from DACs to DAOs? Because in my view, it really seems like DACs are more efficient and the way things should go. And so I'm just wondering if it's all just regulatory arbitrage and teams are trying to have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think like two things. One is definitely the regulatory piece. That's a huge consideration for DAOs. So that's spot on. I think the second is unfortunately, or maybe, I think it's just been a matter of narrative, and where like the market has kind of like picked up the meme of a DAO and kind of run with it. I think like there's just been a lot more emphasis on having like open organizations, whereas like, you know, companies has a little bit of like a bad taste in people's mouths. Like, you know, this is like representing something that's we're trying to like build against. There might be more to it, but that's sort of my understanding in the market.
There's some questions in the chat. Let's see. Any guidance on how to start getting involved with the DAO? The Discord groups are a bit overwhelming to get a sense of what's happening in the DAO.
Yeah, so I'm with you. Discord is it's super overwhelming. I think what I typically tend to recommend is reaching out to somebody that's in the DAO already, particularly on Twitter, or, you know, maybe it's on Discord, but having like a one-on-one conversation with someone of like, what's your experience like getting involved in this DAO, and what's the best way for me to do that? That's number one. I think there are also some tools out there that are kind of interesting, like Layer 3 is one project that allows you to sign up for bounties across DAOs, so you can, you know, pay or not pay, you can fill out a bounty and do something and then get paid in that DAO's like token, which is like an interesting way to at least start like dipping your toe in. I've also seen some specific DAOs, particularly in the protocol side, have a really active grants program. So like Aave, Uniswap, Compound grants, they're all giving out like, you know, call it like somewhere between like 5 and 50K grants to go build on those protocols. And even if it's just like a small project just to kind of get started, I think that's like a really great way to also feel like start contributing to that community. So I think there's a few different pathways, but if you're looking for maybe like the lowest touch to start with, I would reach out to somebody and just see if you can get like, you know, 20 minutes with them, and unfortunately get kind of manually onboarded right now.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think in the future more people will be gig workers for multiple DAOs rather than just work for one corporation? And if so, what would you recommend us to do to prepare for this future?
Yeah, I mean, I think like this idea of gig workers has been really glorified by mainstream like media and, you know, Silicon Valley and all of that. I think the reality is like it's not probably the best for everyone, but you know, if it's something that appeals to you in the sense that you like working across multiple projects, then I think a DAO or multiple DAOs is like a great way to do this. So I do think people will work for DAOs in the future. I don't know if it's going to be what we saw recently, which was like, oh, I contribute to 10 DAOs. I think it'll maybe look more like, oh, I contribute to 2 DAOs. And that's like more scalable from a just from like a time perspective, and then like context switching. I think the other thing that really needs to be solved for here is a lot of like real life things that you need to do, like how do I get health insurance, or how do I apply for a, you know, an application lease or a rental, like a rental application, and have that tie back to like a DAO based compensation model is still super unclear, particularly in different geographies. And so I think that's going to be something that people are working on figuring out. And until that gets figured out, it's going to be challenging to do this. That being said, if you do want to work on having like work contributing to multiple DAOs, what I would recommend is just getting more familiar with like freelancer or contract work, especially on like the engineering side, and the sort of like scope of what you want to work on, but versus what you don't want to work on, how much you typically get paid for those services, you know, your level of experience, the types of problems you want to solve. I think just like going into the market with a good idea of what you have and then talking to a bunch of different DAOs will lead to better outcomes and hopefully save you some time just in terms of narrowing down where you go. Yeah, so I guess in terms of, I'm just reading, do DAOs assign equal importance to the vote of every member? Is there a way for DAOs to weigh a vote based on the past reputation? So I think a lot of people are actually working on this right now, which is this concept of like, what does a verified credential look like? That's what they're called right now, VCs. And it's this idea that over time, particularly in the blockchain world, you start to build a reputation based on what you vote on or what you participate in or your behavior. And that's how you kind of build this like on-chain score that tells how trustworthy you are or how reputable you are. There really isn't a way to do that today per se, but there is probably a dozen projects out there working on this. Right now, though, it's very, I would say it's very much like, you know, one token equals one vote. I think there's a lot of problems with this, and you'll start to see a lot of problems with this when you go into these DAOs and start to like realize how, you know, somebody who's putting in the work but doesn't necessarily have like the monetary value in tokens is not able to participate in the same meaningful way versus if you have capital, right? At the end of the day, like we're getting into this very hyper financialized situation that can feel dystopian. And so that's definitely something that I think is going to be solved for, again, through things like delegation or reputation, things of that nature. Okay, is there any technical innovation that needs to happen before we realize the full potential of DAOs? Yeah, I think there's actually some really cool technical work happening today. So, you know, one community in particular that I would point to is the Moloch DAO community. They have just like really interesting sort of like autonomous feature sets that features that they're building into the implementation of DAO. So just for background, Moloch is a framework for DAO implementation. They have a set of smart contracts and code, and they basically have built-in features. So I was just reading about this morning. The latest version is allowing for things like flash lending. So you can basically take a loan from like a DAO's treasury, or it's solving for allowing voting and governance to be a little bit more flexible so that you can like change the parameters around a proposal. And all of this is happening within the code. So it's slightly more autonomous than what we have today. So I do think if we want to sort of come to like this final realization of what a DAO is, the decentralized piece is a little bit more labor focused and the autonomous piece is much more technically focused. And so there's definitely some great work happening in that space. And I think like Ethereum as a whole, like just the ecosystem around Ethereum is a great example of, you know, technical innovation that I think is enabling DAOs to even, you know, work to begin with. Let's see. Seems like a potential decentralized risk. Decentralization or a trust risk with DAOs is when they interact with things outside of the blockchain. Yep, the Oracle issue. For example, a real estate investment DAO having to purchase real estate, best practices around this, or DAOs that are addressing this problem. Yes, it's Moloch. So yeah, I think this is like a bigger question around everything blockchain, right? Like at the end of the day, anything that is on a blockchain is really best suited for digitally sourced or like digital native data. this is commonly referred to as the Oracle problem. And a lot of, I think we talk about this less today, but 3 or 4 years ago, it was a very common conversation of when you are using multiple oracles as your source of truth, that you need to be really careful around making sure it's not a centralization risk. It's part of the challenge with a lot of DeFi protocols today, and just a lot of different applications out there where they're ultimately shifting trust from an intermediary to an oracle that could be corrupted. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but at the end of the day, I think like getting comfort with sources of data, and particularly how corruptible your oracles are, is the best way probably to sort of bridge real data, or not real data, sorry, like physical world data and assets with a blockchain. Okay, a very high entry barrier leads to centralization. Very low entry leads to noise overpowering the signal. How high do you think the optimal barrier should be? It's a really good question. I think for me, it's less around, I think like the barriers to entry should always be low, in the sense of anybody can like learn about a DAO, understand what they do, and like have full transparency into their practices. But in order to participate in a meaningful way, there needs to be friction. And I think the reason that friction is so important is because, again, like friction implies that this is something that you want to spend your time on, and therefore you're kind of willing to go jump over some hoops or whatever that may be. The problem is that today, most of the friction is really around, do you have capital, right? Do you have like the money to be able to start contributing to this DAO? And really, I don't think friction should come in the form of just, financial means, but I think there's other pathways, whether it's like, things like what people call like sweat capital. So how much work you put in, or creating just like pathways for contribution, so that there's a way to sort of channel some of the noise into like productivity. And I think a lot of this also just comes down to like going back and looking at how co-ops have worked in the past, and how like large groups have been able to like meaningfully add value to like an organization. A lot of times, I think like being a part of a DAO doesn't even have to go beyond just like simply embodying that like DAO's mission and values, and then spreading that to other people. And I think like that's a lot of what Ethereum does, or some of these other large blockchains, where like, it feels like the everyday user can become a part of that DAO. And the main way that they demonstrate that is through talking about it, and like sharing, like the values and like the mission of that community with other people. So I think there's going to be different levels of contribution as well, and they correspond with different barriers. And then I see a question here: what are some of the major unsolved challenges? A lot of the stuff that I've already talked about here, just like when it relates to their properties, I would consider those unsolved. So the permissionless question, the scalability question, the coordination of labor, and how DAO contribution will actually work moving forward, and how we can sort of onboard folks into DAOs. I think all of those are relatively unsolved for it. Feels like we're still very much in the first inning of the DAO ecosystem, really been, starting very at the beginning of starting to solve these problems. I don't know if there's other questions I missed.
No, I think that covered most. Jason Chi says, how do we measure contributions in DAOs?
Yeah, measuring contributions is a really good question. So I think there's two ways to measure them today. First is like economically, and then second is or maybe not economically, sorry, empirically is like the first way, and then the second way is much more qualitative. So on the sort of empirical side, I think there's ways to tie contributions directly to like the bottom line, transaction volume of a protocol, or the number of new, whatever sort of like your internal KPI might have been. Like, did you onboard X amount of people to the DAO, or did you finish X, Y, and Z? I think like the other piece of it though, which is much more oriented around like the qualitative side is really interesting and something that people are starting to explore. So like, for example, Coordinate is a tool right now that a lot of DAOs are using. It was born out of the Yearn ecosystem. And what Coordinate does is they get people into teams. And then at the end of a certain time period, they have everyone on that team provide peer feedback and basically say like, okay, what did Kinjal contribute during this time period? And what should the value of her contributions be? And that's really where you can get into the nitty gritty of like interpersonal relationships of how you're working with someone or what value you added to the community. And there's like nowhere to hide at that sort of level. And I think that's one really interesting experiment out there that's being run today, which is like measuring contributions by really just like talking to the source of who's working on what and then valuing it accordingly. So I think that's going to be really sort of an interesting category to just follow, which is like qualitatively, how can we get to a quantitative number that measures the value of contributions in a DAO?
It's a very hard thing.
Yeah,
because it's very subjective.
I guess, what are some of the areas that you believe will never be solved by DAOs? That's a good question. I think at the end of the day, like, I think DAOs will probably be horizontal in the sense that I think they'll apply to many different sectors. Like we're starting to see experiments on the science funding side, and we're starting to see experiments in climate and, you know, all these different categories. What I'm really not sure about is whether like a token as an incentive mechanism will be solved for in all of these categories. So it's not to say that you can't bring together a community that's focused on like one particular vertical. It's really more the question of like, how does a token play within that model of like valuing community or valuing a collection, you know, a collection of NFTs that a particular DAO is focused on investing in, or whatever it may be. I think there's challenges on whether token incentivization will make sense and actually end up distributing value back to the users. A lot of these DAOs sort of feel like the token is really just used as a way to gain entry, but not necessarily as a way to like sustain contribution or sustain value. And so that's what I'm most nervous about.
Super helpful. We'll take one or two more and then close it off. What about hostile takeover risks in DAOs? Seems like being able to do 51% attack is a big risk for DAO voting if it's permissionless and all tokens have the same voting power.
Yeah, that's a really that's a great point. I think in particular on the protocol DAO side, that's like been, I think, a key consideration from the beginning. And I think this is, again, why like decentralization is often talked about so much, because it's really important to get your token in the hands of as many, you know, voters and users as possible. So what really people talk about is like, what is the risk of like collusion, or what is the risk of being able to, just like buy 51% of tokens, and who, you know, making sure that there isn't sort of like concentration where one entity owns like 20% of the tokens, and then you can kind of collude with them. So it's really just about like getting your token into the hands of as many people as possible. But there's always a risk of that, and I think it's something that a lot of DAOs are potentially not as worried about as they should be.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, we'll take one last question. It says, can we design different voting mechanisms to balance it out, like quadratic voting?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think we definitely can. I think quadratic voting is super cool. Would love to see it implemented across more DAOs. And I know Gitcoin has been like a steward of that model, and Kevin, but I definitely think there's different voting mechanisms that we can start thinking through. I also like this idea of like dynamic, tokens that shift based on where a community is in their like life cycle. So tokens that are more locked up in the beginning when you're trying to bootstrap your community, or when you're trying to bootstrap just the liquidity within like a particular protocol versus like over time having your token have different sort of like rights or provisions that change based on where you are in life cycle. I think that could be really interesting as it relates to voting. So lots of cool ideas out there, and we can definitely work on designing these.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This was really informative and it gave me something to think about myself. So I appreciate your time. And yeah, if anyone has other questions or anything, is there any way they can reach out to you either via tweet or any other forum?
Yeah, my DMs are open on Twitter, so feel free to reach out. I'm at _Kinjal Shah, and I check those. So yeah, feel free to send me a message if you want to chat more.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you,
All right,
everyone.
have a good day.
Yeah, you too. Bye.